So I always find it really amazing how hard conference organizers work. Just watching them run around taking care of all the details makes me tired. And last night at the speaker's dinner, Jose gave a little speech about how hard his team works and how as a result he doesn't have to do anything. And this afternoon I saw him walking across the exhibition floor and he was just kind of looking really relaxed, like he didn't have a care in the world. So I want to thank all of the conference organizing staff except Jose for doing such a great job. So today I want to talk about the Agile principle of harnessing change for competitive advantage. I want to explore what it really means to do it, and I want to present the view that in order to truly do it, we need to bring Agile and DevOps together with design thinking. My perspective reflects my background, which crosses the entire development, QA, and operations spectrum. I've worked for a variety of companies, from startups to tech companies to enterprises, but it was two things that I discovered simultaneously about 10 years ago that have really influenced my approach to my work. The first was design thinking, and in particular service design, and the second was cloud computing. And when I put those two together, I realized that when you look at modern approaches to IT, whether it be IT as a service or infrastructure as a service or software as a service, that service really is the center of everything we do. And since then, I've built a consulting company that focuses primarily on helping companies build teams that continuously learn both from their customers and from each other. And I typically get brought in as a consultant when an organization is trying to do something new and it's not going the way they expected. We're doing Scrum, we're running containers, how come we're not going faster? What are we doing wrong? Now, that's actually the wrong question. A better question would be, where should we go next? Because transformation isn't about changing from point A to point B, it's about developing the ability to change. One of the biggest misunderstandings that I see about Agile and DevOps is that they are ways of doing the same thing faster. Their real purpose is giving us the ability to continuously self-improve. But before we can talk about how to do that, we need to take a step back. And we need to understand why we need to do it in the first place. And what we need to understand is we are actually living in a different world. We have left the industrial economy. We spent the last 250 years optimizing our ability to design and build and deliver products at scale. But now we have fully moved into this new post-industrial society that has very different rules and very different characteristics, and the companies that are succeeding are the ones that understand and know how to respond to those new rules. And the key characteristic is a shift from an economy driven by products to one driven by services. And that involves a shift from a focus on making things to delivering experiences, from momentary transactions to ongoing relationships, from marketing as broadcast to marketing as the ability to listen and understand and respond. And as service is becoming more pervasive, it's also becoming more digital. But we're not just talking about making digital things instead of making physical ones. The digital world is really permeating the physical world and breaking down familiar boundaries between the different parts of our lives and our work and our systems. When you go to the doctor, your experience is partly about the doctor, it's partly about the staff, it's partly about the office. And as I'm saying this, I'm realizing that the experience of medicine and healthcare may be very different in Europe than it is in America. So pretend you're in America for the next few minutes, and hopefully this will make sense. In any case, it's also partly about the website that you use to check your test results and all of the applications that the doctors and nurses use to update your blood pressure and order medication, and all of the back-end IT systems that connect the doctor's office to the radiology lab, to the pharmacy, to the website that you use. And the quality of your experience is a result of the totality of all of those components and their interactions. And this has the effect of fundamentally changing the nature of the systems that we need to manage. We are used to managing systems that may be very complicated and may have a lot of moving parts, but it's possible to manage and control and understand the relationships between those parts. Very few of us can fix our own cars anymore. They cover the engine in plastic so you can't even find the spark plugs. But we can still understand them well enough so that if you have a flat tire and the dealer tries to sell you a new fuel injector, you know that something is fishy. And we can see these complicated systems at play when we look at things like the traditional data center, where we have at least the illusion that we can separate it out and treat the various layers independently. So you have physical plant, and you have network and database and storage and application A over here and application B over there. And we can also see it at play in the traditional org chart, where you have this nice visual diagram that separates things out into pieces, into divisions and departments and teams. And the basic premise is that as long as you do your job and I do my job, the company as a whole will succeed. But the kinds of tangled systems that we see with digital service are more like the kinds of complex systems that we encounter in nature and human society. They involve very rich, unconstrained, mutually amplifying relationships between the components, and you can't break them apart without the whole thing falling down. You can't fully understand the restaurant outside of the context of the neighborhood that it's in and the zoning laws in that neighborhood and the politics that control those zoning laws. And we can see this new complexity when we look at what's happening to the data center with decentralized clouds of microservices, with more and more intimate interactions between front-end and back-end systems, with more and more of the IT and application architecture running entirely out of your data center. And we can also see it with what's happening with organizational design. Whether it's holacracy or adhocracy or inner source or pod-based companies, they are all about treating companies less like machines and more like biological systems. And working with complex systems, and apparently today my clicker is a complex system because it's not behaving the way I want it to. In any case, working with complex systems is a bit like going through the looking glass. You encounter these very strange and counterintuitive behaviors, like structure that has no rules, failure that has no root cause. And that means that it becomes impossible to model or control or predict or even understand them the way we're used to. They combine flexibility and adaptability with unavoidable and unpredictable failure. And in fact, when we try and manage complex systems the way we're used to, they have this terrible tendency to flip from being sloppily resilient to being brittle. So we need a new strategy. We need to shift our approach from trying to control things, whether it be systems or employees or customers or markets, to having the ability to steer our way through environments over which we have less and less control or ability to predict. Wow, this is really bad. I may have to go over there, which would be terrible. I can't talk if I can't walk around. So we're going to steer our way through here. Now, traditionally, we approach learning as something that you go off and do. And then you come back and you try to do that thing for as long as you can. But in the face of complexity, learning is kind of all we can do, and it actually starts to become what we do every day. It starts to become operations. Operations becomes less about do it the same way every time and more about do it better every time. So what does that do to, and you know what, I'm going to give up on this. I'm just going to go over here and wander back and forth. Bear with me. What does that do to things like operational excellence and operational efficiency? We need a new strategy for that as well. Imagine that you're in a canoe or a kayak and you're on a river that has hidden currents and changing winds. If you paddle really hard a couple of times and then you sit back, you get blown way off course and you have to paddle your way back on course, and it's very inefficient. It's very wasteful. Whereas if you are continually steering in small increments, it's actually more efficient. And it's more efficient to push that button than that one. This is exactly where Agile comes into play. But we need to clear up some misunderstandings. Agile is not about speed. It's not about maximizing velocity. It's not about sprinting. It's not about doing more work in less time. The dictionary definition of agility is the efficiency and effectiveness with which you can change direction. So we need to distinguish between agility and speed. When you're skiing, the best way to go fast is not to turn. Every course correction slows you down. I find it really interesting that Lindsey Vonn, the winningest female skier in history, is brilliant at downhill and not very good at slalom, to the point where she doesn't ski it very often anymore. Whereas slalom is about how early and smoothly and continuously you can steer. Ingemar Stenmark, the winningest male skier in history, was fantastic at slalom and not very good at downhill. And so we need to understand that if we're looking at things strictly from the perspective of speed, that Agile practices like stand-ups and sprint demos and retrospectives actually slow you down. So if we go back to the Agile Manifesto, and we look past the first page with its we value X over Y statements, and we look at the Agile principles, there's one in particular that I think perfectly captures not only the essence of Agile, but really the essence of everything we're talking about, which is harnessing change for competitive advantage. We've learned to treat change as a sign of weakness. It means we couldn't make up our minds. I still remember projects from years ago where we'd work on something for a year and a half, and then the project would get canceled, and we'd feel very discouraged and demoralized. But if you can steer early, smoothly, and continuously, you can actually turn it to your advantage. Now, Agile has a problem, though, which is that it talks a lot about delivering value, but it doesn't actually deliver anything. And this is an artifact of the product economy, where one company would build software and then burn it onto a CD, or, God forbid, put it on a floppy disk, and give it to a customer, and it was the customer's responsibility to run it. But when software becomes service, the same company that builds it runs it. And so you could say that DevOps is simply completing the Agile equation. But again, we need to clarify some misunderstandings, because DevOps is not just Release Management 2.0. It's not just about how fast you can deliver to production or how often. Imagine there's a new restaurant in town, and Jose says you should really try it out, this restaurant, it's fantastic. So you go to it on a Saturday night, Monday morning you go to work and people ask you how it was, and you say, well, the food was great, but the service was awful. You will be a lot less likely to try it because you see the food and the service as part of the same experience. And we struggle with this word DevOps, and sometimes I think it's because it's too simple. That the reason that we take Dev and Ops and smash them together into this new word is simply because we recognize that we have to treat functionality and operability together as one thing. The most concise expression of DevOps that I've encountered is the 3 ways of DevOps from the Phoenix project. The first one, which is the most familiar, is flow. Minimizing the friction involved with getting our ideas into production where a customer can use them. But the second one is feedback, getting information about the quality and the relevancy of what we just delivered. And when we put those two together, we achieve the ability of continuous experimentation and learning. And this is really the deepest meaning and the deepest purpose of DevOps. Now, what do we mean when we talk about learning? What are we doing when we learn? Well, we're changing something about ourselves internally in response to something that's going on outside. And in order to do that, we need a level of internal flexibility and adaptability. And so what things like microservices and 2-pizza microservice teams are after is giving us that level of flexibility, transforming our systems and organizations into something less complicated and more complex, where it's easier for things to come into and out of existence and change without a lot of friction. But we still have a problem. If all we do is shatter our systems and organizations into lots of little pieces, we risk replacing a few large silos with 1,000 little ones. We still need some kind of attractive force that pulls the pieces back together into a coherent whole that delivers a coherent experience without reintroducing all of the friction and brittleness we were trying to get away from. And the good news is the answer is right in front of us. The same thing that got us into trouble can get us out of it. Instead of treating the pieces as disconnected little components going on about their own business, we can treat them as mutual service providers. And this requires shifting our attention outwards and upwards from ourselves and what we do and towards our internal and external customers and what it is they're trying to accomplish and what they need help with. By a certain poetic irony, I think the best definition of service that I've ever encountered comes from, of all places, ITIL. ITIL talks a lot about service, and it starts by trying to define it. And it does it with this wonderful phrase, which is facilitating desirable outcomes. And in fact, if you read the introduction to ITIL v3, it actually talks about how what's important is not the CRM system that you build and operate. What's important is what the staff can accomplish with the help of that CRM system. Now, DevOps likes to talk about breaking down silos. But I'm going to tell you a secret. And I'll only tell you if you all promise not to repeat it outside of this room, because it's a very deep and dark secret. The secret is you can't actually get rid of silos. You can only move them around. When DevOps talks about autonomous, cross-functional product teams, that's great. It's wonderful. We should all do it. But it leaves two important questions unanswered. The first is the one that we were just talking about of how do we align all of these pieces with each other. But the more basic question is, all of this wonderful stuff that you're deploying 10 times a day, where does it run? And DevOps, as it was originally imagined, kind of assumes a cloud. Well, if that's a public cloud, that's the biggest silo in the history of IT. Amazon won't even tell you exactly where their data centers are. Oh, it's somewhere in Northern Virginia. On the other hand, if it's a private cloud, someone still has to run it. Someone has to make sure that there's fuel for the backup generators, that the network will scale, that that wonderful zero-friction PaaS platform that you tipped up actually runs properly. So no matter how you slice it, you still have to account for interactions between teams that have different roles and motivations and perspectives. And so it becomes service all the way down. Your company is a service provider. Your IT department is a service provider. Your microservices and microservice teams are service providers. Your network and security and platform teams are service providers. At every level of the organization, your job is no longer just to do what you do, but rather it's to help each other create larger value, and by extension, help your customers create larger value. Now, in order to help each other, we need to understand each other's perspectives. And that means that it isn't enough to optimize for time to market or mean time to repair or cost of delivery or what have you. We also have to optimize for empathy. And this is what design thinking brings to the table, because it's basically about building user-centeredness into the fabric of your work. IBM has made a massive commitment to design thinking. But they're not just bringing in armies of UX designers to do product design. What they're trying to do is to teach every single employee to think like a designer. And that means more than just making things look good or even making things easy to use. It means solving for 3 dimensions simultaneously. The first is feasibility. Can we make it? No matter how beautiful or original or politically provocative your coffee mug is, if it breaks every time you pour hot liquid into it, it's a failure as a design. The second is viability. Can we run a business making it? If it costs $1,000 to make a coffee mug that doesn't crack and you can only sell it for $4, it still doesn't do you any good. And the third is desirability. Does it address a genuine human need? Will people want to take your coffee mug off the shelf and drink their coffee with it? IT has traditionally solved for feasibility. We try and build and run systems that work. And when we hear things like aligning IT with the business, we're being challenged to address viability. But we have to go further and incorporate desirability. As a prime example, I'm going to make you wait for it. In the US, there is a federal standards body called NIST, and they're responsible for things like security policies. And recently, they published an article with a massive apology in it. And they said, you remember when we told you you needed these really complicated passwords with lots of numbers and strange characters? Well, we were wrong. It's actually a really bad idea, and we're very sorry. And their article contained a remarkable sentence. Far too often, security fails because we forget people are involved. What's remarkable to me about this sentence is not that they said, we're really sorry we made security so hard to use. What they said was our own technical goals failed because we didn't engage in user-centered design. So if everyone, even security people, need to empathize, what does that word even mean? There's as much confusion about it as there is about Agile and DevOps. Some people will say that empathy means wallowing in someone else's pain. One well-known philosopher has declared empathy the enemy. He thinks it's the root of all human ills, and we need compassion instead. Now, to me, that represents a misunderstanding of both empathy and compassion, but that's a story for a different day. But my favorite is the idea that sociopaths are really good at empathizing. And my answer to that is that if you have a sociopath on your staff, you have a much bigger problem. Design thinking isn't going to solve it. You have an HR problem. I use a very simple and down-to-earth definition of empathy, which is the ability to see things as if from another's perspective. As a developer, a tarball and an email with manual deployment instructions might be perfectly fine. But what does that look like from the perspective of the ops person who has to deploy and manage that app? From an IT perspective, having to fill out 4 ServiceNow requests and wait 20 to 40 days for a new server may actually be the most efficient and cost-effective way to manage IT resources. But what is the experience of the tester who needs to spin up a new swim lane in order to test a critical hotfix? And the reason that we need empathy is because we're trying to connect these parts of the organization that see things differently. I had a fascinating interaction with a network engineer who was very frustrated because the marketing group would publish printed collateral that had references to domains they hadn't registered yet. And he threw up his arms and he went, I don't know how they don't get that. It's just common sense. And without thinking, I blurted out, well, obviously it's not common sense because they don't do it. And he sat back and his eyes got big, and you could see that he was starting to realize not everyone thinks about things the same way that I do. The other thing we need to understand about design is that it is a very open-ended, non-linear, creative process of discovering good solutions, not analyzing correct ones. People will often say that design thinking is how you understand the problem before you try to understand the solution. That's not how designers generally work. They start making things really fast, and they use them as a way to look at them and understand the problem better. They also have the ability to engage in a suspension of disbelief that makes it possible to find ideas that might seem really bad but turn out to be the best ones. So Frank Gehry couldn't have designed buildings like this without advanced computer modeling software. But he also couldn't have designed them if he couldn't let go of the idea that a building has to be a rectangular box with a few simple geometric forms on top of it. So in order to navigate this new world of complexity and service that we find ourselves in, we have to bring together the ability to steer with the ability to learn, with the ability to empathize and explore. But we need to do it in a way that isn't just bolting things onto each other. I've seen methodological diagrams where you do a little lean startup, and then you do a little design thinking, and then you do a little agile, and then you do a little DevOps, and there are these circles and arcs spinning off in every direction, and it starts to look like something that came out of a particle collider. So what is it that unifies these things? What do they have in common? Well, they are all about adaptive control by leveraging the power of feedback loops. Now, feedback is a word that we all use, and we probably all assume we know what it is. It actually has a specific meaning, technically, which is information about the gap between what we expected would happen and what actually did happen. So you think that a new user interface will make a certain task easier for users, but user testing tells you something different. You think that your code is going to work in a certain way, but Jenkins tells you something different. You think that an infrastructure change is going to have some impact on performance, your monitoring tools tell you something different. And unless you allow yourself to be influenced and changed by the feedback you get, it's a waste of time. And that may seem obvious, but sadly it's not. I ran a workshop for a company that had a very sophisticated Agile and DevOps practice. And during the morning, I asked them to do an exercise, which was to reimagine one of their linear processes as a circular feedback-driven process. And they all kind of smiled and nodded wisely, and one of them raised his hand and said, well, we don't really have any linear processes left. We've made them all circular. And I said, okay, well, indulge me. Let's just do it, and maybe it'll be really quick and easy, and we'll go on with the rest of the day. And I'd broken them out into 4 teams, and 3 of the 4 teams independently came to the same conclusion, which they very sheepishly reported to me. They realized that they were very good at collecting feedback, but they didn't actually do anything with it. They didn't actually change anything based on what they heard. And they realized that they were wasting a tremendous amount of time, money, and energy doing all of this work and then just throwing it on the floor. What we're trying to accomplish is the ability to have empathetic conversations with our customers and with each other. The word converse literally means switch back and forth. So you speak, or you build something, or you deliver something to the marketplace, and then you have to listen and understand and respond to what you've heard. Because if all you do is just ship things to the market faster and faster, you're really engaging in a sequence of non sequiturs. So when we become able to converse meaningfully with our customers, we become able to learn continuously. But we also want to be able to learn safely. How do you go fast without breaking things? And by putting Agile and DevOps together with design thinking, we give ourselves the ability to do it in 2 ways. The first is by learning as much as we can before we build or deploy anything. When you can do user research and prototyping and design critique and user testing, you can break and fix things as many times as you want without any harm to anyone. So what I tell everyone I work with at every level of the organization, all the way down into the bowels of the infrastructure organization, is that you should observe your users on a regular basis. If you're the networking group and you're frustrated with the marketing team because they're doing the wrong thing, go watch them. Try and understand why they're doing the wrong thing. Try and think of how you might be able to help them successfully do the right thing. In my experience, there is nothing so humbling or valuable as just watching your users try to do the very thing that you want them to do. Secondly, take the opportunity to experiment. Too often as engineers, we jump to the first plausible solution. One of the most wonderful DevOps practices is blameless postmortems, which you might call empathetic postmortems, because what we're trying to do is understand an incident from the perspective of the operators who ostensibly might have caused it. But what I see happen often is we have a great idea about how we might make things better for them, and then we run off and build it. When really all we have is a hypothesis, and it might make them better, and it might not. And finally, if you don't listen to the feedback from your experiments, they're not really experiments. And listening is a really hard thing to do. I often in my work encounter two teams that are at loggerheads in conflict with each other. This is the classic dev and ops problem. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll have them do a mutual listening and design session together, where each team will have a certain amount of time where they are able to talk about what they need and what's frustrating them and what's not working for them. And the other team is asked to just listen. Don't interrupt, don't ask questions, don't even take notes. Just openly, receptively listen. And then we flip it. So each team has the feeling that they've had the opportunity to talk and they've had the opportunity to be listened to and heard. And then when I have them jointly design a mutually satisfying solution, a magical thing happens. Instead of saying, this is what needs to change in order for it to work for us, they start saying, this is what we need to change in order for it to start working for you. And the second way that we make learning safe is by reducing the risk of building and deploying themselves. And this is what continuous integration and continuous delivery and microservices and A/B testing and all of the rest of them are all about. I like to tell, I have a joke where I should offer a fixed fee consulting service where I will walk around an organization doing nothing but repeating the same sentence over and over and over again. Make your work smaller. Ask smaller questions, run smaller experiments, build smaller things, do smaller deployments. I can't tell you how many times I go into an organization and the thing that's giving them problems and the thing that are creating blockages is simply that they're trying to do things that are too big. I've been thinking about this word release because ultimately what we're trying to do is release something, right? And I realize that the word is more poetic than we give it credit for, because we really do release things out into the wild, and when we do, we lose control of them. There isn't any way to guarantee that we can know in advance exactly how they're going to work or exactly how people are going to use them. And that means that designing and building features isn't enough. We also need to design and build the ability to observe them and actually understand what's going on in the real world. You know, we hear about things like game days and chaos engineering, which has this intimidating name. And interestingly, Netflix has changed the name to resilience engineering. But the point of all of it is that there's an understanding that there is failure and surprise and novelty and opportunity lurking out there. We can either sit back and wait for it to hit us, or we can go out and look for it. One of the things that frustrates me with the whole linear approach to Agile and DevOps is there's this idea that we do a bunch of really good work and then we're done. And we can fight over the definition of done, but there's still an assumption that at some point we're done. When the reality is that deployment is actually the beginning, not the end. I was head of development at a startup a number of years ago, and we had a major customer who really wanted this one particular feature. And for whatever reason, it took us a really long time to get it to them. And they got more and more frustrated with us. And finally, we delivered it, and they were thrilled, and they thanked us profusely, and we felt really good about ourselves for about 3 days. And then they came back and they said, you know, when you gave us feature X, when we started to use it, it made us realize that now we want feature Y. When can we have feature Y? The point is that feature Y wasn't in our backlog. It couldn't have been in our backlog because it wasn't even conceivable until the customer started using feature X. So what we're really after here is to become organizations that are able to ask and answer the question, how can we be more helpful in a continuous fashion? If we go back to our old friend public cloud, why is it that public cloud seems to work and isn't just this big, giant, annoying silo that we want to get rid of? Well, at least in the case of Amazon, it's because they are constantly asking the question of how can we be more helpful. My first ever consulting project in my current business was helping a small company forklift their application out of colo with failing hardware and onto the Amazon cloud. And it was very straightforward and simple, but we wanted to take advantage of some of the basic Amazon capabilities. So we did things like load balancing the web servers across multiple availability zones and so on and so forth. And then we came to the Memcache server, which in those days was something that sat right in the middle of pretty much every standard LAMP application. And it turns out it's really hard to cluster a Memcache server. And sort of after fighting with it for a while, we decided to give up. It's a cache. If it falls over, the application knows how to fall back to the database. It'll be slower, but we can survive until somebody can tip the cache back up, so we're not going to let it slow it down. Let it slow us down. So we decided to do that. We went about our business. We finished the port. Everything was good. And I swear that about 3 weeks later, Amazon announced a new feature called Elasticache, on-demand clustered Memcache. You go to the console and you push a button and then you say, I want a Memcache server and I want it running in these 2 availability zones. And I remember wondering if they were reading our emails. And if it had been Google, I would have assumed they were reading our emails. But what they were doing is they were watching and talking to people like us and asking themselves, what is their struggle? And how can we do the next thing to use our capabilities to ease that struggle? And I think, I've heard heads of IT at enterprises talk about how Amazon is the competition now for internal IT. And I think that's true from the perspective that what our job has become, whether we're a networking group or a 2-pizza team or a testing organization or a database team, is to always be figuring out how to use our capabilities to help ease others' struggle. So in closing, I figured I should say something about testing. This is a testing conference, right? Am I in the right, Jose, am I in the right place? Still open for question? So what does all of this have to do with testing? Well, what I've tried to communicate today is the idea that feedback is the heart of everything that we need to do now, whether it's Agile or DevOps or design thinking or lean startup or digital business as a whole. What is feedback? It's information about the gap between actual and expected. What is a bug? It's information about the gap between actual and expected. I think that we could make the claim, I would make the claim, that testing is at the heart of everything that we're trying to do in terms of new methodologies. I've had some interesting conversations recently with a couple of folks about whether DevOps needs to be expanded to whether it's really Dev Test Ops. And interestingly, if you look at the original DevOps Wikipedia page, it has a Venn diagram with 3 circles: Dev, QA, and Ops. So do we need to change the name? Well, I'm not sure. Sometimes I think it really should be Funk Ops, because the point of it is that whatever we're doing, whether it's design or development or testing, we need to be thinking about functionality and operability. But to be honest, I'm not sure if we can really fix the name. Because when you look at the conversations around Dev Test Ops and DevSec Ops and Dev Biz Ops, I start to think that we're going to need 32 bits to actually represent the whole thing when we're done. But the point is that whatever it's called and however vocal or silent your part of it is, that what you do and what you think about and what you represent is absolutely central to 21st century business. In a sense, you could say that learning through testing is what it's all about and really all it is that we can do at this point. So thank you very much, and if you're interested in learning more about rethinking IT and rethinking quality in the digital service economy, I wrote a book for O'Reilly called Designing Delivery, and I will end with a shameless plug. I actually have discount coupons if you're interested. See me afterwards. And on that note, thank you very much.